So I actually started my career as a teacher back in the 80s, and I taught in what is now the alternative school system in Salt Lake City. And I did that for about 3 years, and then I went to work for the court system in Utah. And I worked for some time as a juvenile court probation officer for about 8 years. And then one day, the woman who was running all the mediation programs for the state court system came to me and she said, "Hey, why don't we do victim offender mediation?" And I said, "Well, what is that?" And she said, "Well, it's when we bring victims and offenders of crime together and we have them talk about what happened and have them kind of resolve it between the two of them instead of the court kind of telling them how it's going to get resolved." And I looked at her and I said, "Are you crazy? I spend all day keeping these people apart from each other, and now you're telling me we're like going to bring them together in the same room?" Because I really saw my job as a probation officer somewhat as protecting the victim from the offender and somehow holding the offender accountable for the victim. But I was in the middle of all of that, right, as the probation officer. So she said, "Oh, Kathy, set one up." So I said, "Okay." So I set up this case where these kids had broken into a neighbor's home and trashed it. And I don't know if you've ever seen a home trashed by teenagers, but all the blinds were down. They'd let off fire extinguishers all through the house, had thrown food and crap everywhere. And these 3 kids came in with their parents, who their parents had been kind of diminishing what had really happened. They weren't really taking it extremely seriously. And the couple came in that owned the home, and Diane was there as the mediator. And I sat in that mediation for about 2 hours and listened to this couple talk to these kids about what it was like for them to come home and what it was like for them to see their home in such disarray. And I watched these kids talk to the couple, and literally I'd worked for the court for 9 or 10 years, and I had never seen anything like it before in my life. And it changed my career because literally, finally, the kids got it, and the victims were able to actually interact with people. And from then on, I saw my career at that point in time as kind of being in the probation department. And from that moment on, I got trained as a mediator, and I changed my movement in the court system. And within a year, I'd left the juvenile court system in Salt Lake, and I was working for the administrative office under this woman who'd done the mediation, and I was working in the mediation department. And just that humanity that mediation allowed between this victim and the offenders changed my perspective of how we should deal with conflict and things like that. And just so you know, we do have so my job initially was to create victim offender mediation programs throughout the state in juvenile court, which I did. And there's actually a pretty good one up here in the Logan area, and they're statewide. Some courts are more supportive of them than others, but we kind of started the movement here in Utah. And then in 2000, I was made the director of all the mediation programs in the state of Utah for the state court system. So I traveled throughout the state and created programs where people could resolve I was actually called the Director of Alternative Dispute Resolution, ADR. And basically what that means is my job was to create alternatives for people to resolve their disputes outside of the litigated court system. And so I went throughout the state doing that. And then in 2008, I actually left because I realized that as a director, I was doing budgets and policies and dealing with staff. And I thought, I love to mediate. What am I doing in this director job where I'm having to do all this stuff that I don't love? And so I left. And since then, I've been working for myself and have a private practice, and I'm a full-time mediator. Basically, what I do most days is I mediate family disputes. And typically, and one of the programs that was implemented while I was the director back in 2005 is, for those of you who don't know, anyone getting a divorce now in the state of Utah, if you don't agree on the issues in your divorce, you mandatorily have to go through mediation. It's now a required step in every divorce in the state of Utah. And so most of what I do now is I work with couples who are divorcing, or couples who have been divorced and now they still have issues, or I'm working with people who have children and have never been married. So I'm typically working on child custody and those kinds of things. I'm also on contract with the U.S. Postal Service and the Department of Homeland Security, and I do workplace mediation for those two agencies. And then I do some training and really some conflict intervention in different organizations kind of as they hire me. But I train for Salt Lake County pretty regularly. I do their training on having difficult conversations in the workplace, kind of basic communication and conflict resolution for the county. So that's what I do every day, and that's kind of how I got there, is kind of through this path through juvenile court and then up into the administrative office of the courts. Yes?
Kathy, did you mention your one situation that you've been involved in regarding death row inmates?
So the other work that I've done, and I haven't had a case for a while, but I have a colleague. So my specialty ended up being victim offender mediation. And so I was on a national board for a while, and I met a woman who is a very good friend of mine now in Pennsylvania. And she and I, from time to time, are contacted to do what we call victim offender dialogues. And notice the word mediation is not being used. I'm using the word dialogue. And we've been hired in, I think, about 5 cases across the U.S. to work with inmates who are on death row and bring them together with victims of, well, clearly not the victims, because these are all homicide cases, but surviving victims of the people that were killed that want to have a conversation with these inmates prior to their execution. And most of these cases I've done are family cases. So I worked with a daughter whose mother killed her father. And we worked to bring the mother and the daughter together to have a conversation to figure out, could they have a relationship 8 years after it had all happened, and they needed to have these conversations. So the other thing I've worked on, and I've done several cases here in Utah, where bringing together people who want to talk to the person who took a loved one's life and allowing them to have those conversations with the person who basically last saw their loved one alive. And the power of those is pretty incredible. And it's not for everyone. And we don't do it unless the victim seeks out that contact. This is not a program where the offender gets to say, hey, ring up the father of this child that I murdered and see if they want to meet with me. It's that the victims have this need to talk to this person who did this, and the victims seek out and at some point finally get hooked up with someone like me who will do the work and will bring them together. Most cases last somewhere around a year, because it's mostly preparatory work before we bring them together, and then we bring them together once, and it usually lasts a day. All day they talk, meet, and then we do follow-up work. Question?
Yeah, I'm just curious as what the victim gains out of that experience. What are they hoping to get in?
And I'm going to put that question back to you. I mean, what do you think a victim would get out of doing that kind of work?
Hi, this is Kobe from Logan. The only thing I could think of really is a form of closure that they're looking for.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that word is kind of, I don't know, it's a weird word, closure, because what the victims will tell me is there's never closure. But here's what I will tell you is that the victims tell me that often they want to know what happened. Like they lost someone and they have no idea. So I had one I did in Utah, and this woman's son was murdered, and basically she had a question, and the question was, did he know he was going to be shot? Literally, because she never knew the answer to that. Through all the court system and everything, she really never understood how it all happened, because he was in a car at the driver's wheel when he got shot. And so we basically did this dialogue with the offender, and through doing diagrams and her talking with this offender, she actually, after like 7 years of wondering, almost on a daily basis, were my son's last moments in this fear, knowing that his life was going to end or that he was going to be shot? And the answer was no. He didn't even see it coming. And so there's some things that, like I said, it's not for everyone, but people who want those kinds of answers, there's literally only one person that can give it to them, and it's the person who took their loved one's life. And so people seek this out and want to have those conversations. Any other comments on why you think a victim would want to do this? I mean, that is the most common reason, is they want to know what happened and why. And there's really no answer to why, other than the offender telling their life story. And I'm not really like doing my presentation on that kind of work, but it's pretty intense, and there's many dimensions to it.
This is Bridget and Logan. Do you suppose that for some, is there any interest in understanding whether the offender has changed, experienced remorse?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, what most victims want to hear is, I am sorry, and if I could do this differently, I would do it differently. I mean, many of the victims want to hear that. They want to know that someone cares. And the reason we do so much prep work is that if I don't have an offender who is somewhat remorseful and wanting to try to help this victim get the information they need, we don't do the dialogue. I mean, this is not, we just pull them out of their cell one day and put them in front of the victim. There are cases that I've done 9 or 10 months on a monthly basis of preparation until I feel like it's time for these people that they can come together and no one's going to leave worse off. So let's relate that then to mediation. So what is a mediator? What is my job? Let's have one of the people out in the other areas. So Moab, Rexburg, Salt Lake. What is the job of a mediator? What is my job?
This is Scott Miller in Rexburg. The way I see it, the mediator is the person that's there to guide the discussion, to really kind of be the referee.
Okay. Any other comments on what the job of a mediator is or is not?
This is Brennan in Moab, and I feel like, not only is the mediator a referee, but they're a facilitator. The mediator has the objective in mind, the goal of the meeting or whatever's happening, and they're trying to facilitate achieving that goal. So not only are they trying to, keep the punches above the belt, but they're really trying to do more than that. They're trying to help move things in a positive direction to achieving the goal for the meeting.
Okay. Any comments from this group about the role of a mediator, what it is or it is not?
This is Heidi in Salt Lake. I would say that a mediator should not take sides. They're just there to listen.
Absolutely. Did you have
I was
something?
going to say it's a third party that probably doesn't have a connection within the like, for example, a couple.
Yep.
And I also think it's important that there's a third party, so there's another witness, and it's not just them talking to each other, but now Now you can make assumptions and know what's taking place and be rational.
I do hope. Okay, so absolutely, all of you are correct. So my job is oh, sorry.
Just that, you probably before, or you probably see the value of the two parties coming together that they couldn't get to without you there. There's and you kind of strip down the maybe the emotion of it, and help those parties get to a value created really by working with each other that they wouldn't have otherwise.
Thank you. Yes. So the thing I love most about my role as a mediator is that I don't get to make any decisions. Okay? I love that about my job. If anything gets resolved between the two parties, it is because the two parties have come to understand the situation well enough that now they're willing to actually make agreements around what is happening. So as a mediator, I don't have any decision-making authority. I am unbiased, and I am not taking any kind of sides in the situation. My job literally is to try to help the people listen to one another in a way in which they can, and I always say to people, if nothing else, just listen to the other side and for one moment believe that their perspective has value. All you do is keep making assumptions about each other and going back and forth with your rhetoric until you can say, I can see how you feel that way. I can see how you could see it that way. I could see how you believe that in this, what I'm saying, that you believe that this is what I mean. And let me tell you, that isn't what I mean. Listen to me and let me tell you what I really do mean. But when it's emotional and it's coming up against us, our immediate reaction is to say, I'm not going to deal with it and I'm going to protect myself. And so part of my job as a mediator is to try to get everybody to a place where they can take a really deep breath and feel like they don't have to push so hard on the other person. And it actually opens up a space for them to be heard. And who in this class does not want to be heard? When something is really important to us, one of the greatest gifts another person can give us is to truly hear us and to hear what we're feeling, why we're feeling that way, and possibly what we need in that moment. It doesn't mean that I have to give the person that. It just means that I have to hear that that's what they need and that's what's going on. And as the mediator, it's my role to try to create an environment where that can happen. And sometimes it happens beautifully, and sometimes it never happens. I'm not going to tell you that this is a silver bullet. It's up to the people and how much they're willing to risk and be vulnerable and to put themselves out there to truly try to resolve the disputes. The good news is most of the work I do is with parents, and often parents are willing to step up for their kids and to say, I'm willing to listen to you because I want to do what's best for our kids. Does that bring up any comments or questions? Yes.
So if you discover that one of the parties in all your preparations is really not willing to hear the other side, or to hear the other side, do you just recommend not going forward with any kind of mediation, or?
Well, and let me clarify. It's only the cases that I did on the death row that I do preparatory work. When I have a divorcing couple coming into my office, I don't know anything about them. I have their names on my calendar. I don't do any of my own scheduling. I have an assistant that answers my phone, takes my calls, answers questions, does all my scheduling. So what I get is a file with names on it, and they walk in the room, and we decide how we're going to do this today. So I don't have the luxury of that, but if it's clear that they're not going to be able to do that, then one of the strategies I'm going to use is to put them in separate rooms. And for me to then be the person that takes information back and forth, trying to get things resolved, because then the attitude of the other person is not in the other person's face. And often that's how we get things resolved, like in a high conflict divorce, is that I become the person that goes between. I don't tell people what to do, but I move the information and the proposals back and forth as they come together, and I take out that pushing back on the other person in the same room, if that makes sense.
So my question, and because I just saw a couple go through a divorce, and so my question to you is there anything that you can do? Because you said you don't get to make decisions, but I'm sure you see these couples that are going through divorce agree to decisions that are not going to lead to their best interest.
Yeah.
And you know, do you deal with that, or do you just have to say they're adults, they can make stupid decisions?
That is an excellent question. And here's what I will tell you is that I believe that one of my roles as a mediator is that if I see something that I feel like is not going to work long term or has some flaws in it, I see my job as a mediator is opening a door for people to look in. So what I may do is say, have you thought about in the future, la, 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 or have you played out how this may work in the future? I'm going to ask questions, and I'm going to try to open a door for them to look in to see if they see what I think may be a problem. And I'm going to open that door by asking a question and let them look in. And if I open the door a couple times and they look in and they don't have an issue, they're going to make the decision. But I do believe I have a responsibility as that objective person who's seen all of this to be able to say, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? You know, you two are talking about having daily contact about your kids, and you two cannot even sit in the same room today. Is that really something that can happen? And when it breaks down, what's going to happen to your kids, right? So I'm going to ask questions, but in the end, they're going to make the decisions. And, you know, it's not my role to decide how someone else is going to live their life. Yeah.
So this is Heidi in Salt Lake. So I actually worked for DCFS recently, and I was there for about 8 years. And I'm not trying to be a devil's advocate, but when we would do mediations, they were hardly ever successful. So I just can't help but think that with mediation with DCFS, they need to get attorneys out of the picture and just have the mediator with the parents and the caseworker. I think they would probably be a lot more successful. But again, it was difficult because these judges would just say, oh, we'll do mediation, but there sometimes just didn't really seem to be much of a purpose, or, you know, what are we going to try and resolve? And so, you know, mediation would get done, well, we didn't figure anything out, we have to go back. So I just think, again, it would be really beneficial to have the courts really have a purpose behind what the mediation is for and get the attorneys out of the picture.
Thank you. And the Child Welfare Program is one of the programs that I was the director of for 8 years. And I will say to you that it's not always successful, and it really is dependent on the ability of the professionals, and you're kind of saying the attorneys. All mediation, so I do a lot of cases every day where the attorneys and their clients are there. So I've got the divorcing party and I've got their attorney there with them. And there is no doubt that some days what keeps us from getting an agreement between these two parents is one of the attorneys for one of the parents. I will tell you that, absolutely, that happens. And so the only way a mediation can be successful is when professionals are willing to step back and say, kind of like a mediator does, these people, I'm going to advise them about what their rights are and what they need to be considering, but in the end, it's not my life. And I think one of the, so Brad said to kind of tell you my life path. One of the big things that's changed for me in my life path since I've gone into mediation is that I've come to realize that I don't have a clue what is best for anyone. In fact, sometimes even me, right? Like I have a hard time knowing what's best for me, Kathy. How in the world do I know what's best for a family whose kids have been taken away, going back to, I think it's Heidi? How do I know what's best for them? How can I, as a professional who's worked on this case for 2 weeks, have the audacity to believe that I know what's best for this family? So in some ways, the thing I love about mediation is if it's done right, you can get the professionals to back off and to allow people to actually come up and bubble up and talk about what's important to them and what they need to do. When professionals are involved, it's always going to be harder. And in child welfare mediation, I will tell you, I think the best success that program had, at least, and I haven't been involved since '08, so it's been 7 years, we negotiated the language in a lot of petitions so the petition could get resolved. And I don't know if that's still the case, but a lot of times the petition got resolved, which the judges loved because then they didn't have to litigate the petition, and she's shaking her head, I think. But what happened after that was not always resolved. But for the judges, that's enough to make the program a success to them. So from their perspective, that's why the program exists often, I think, is because they don't have to then litigate the petition. And that probably makes more sense to you than a lot of other people in this room, but that's the success of the program.
This is Brad and Logan. Kathy, just quickly, the difference between mediation and arbitration.
Difference between mediation and arbitration is that in an arbitration, you meet with someone and you tell them your story and you give them all your stuff, and they are like a judge, that you literally, they make the decision for you. So when all of you are out there buying cars or getting medical treatment, when you sign all your contracts, you're basically saying that if there's any problem, that we are going to go to arbitration. And just so you're really good consumers in the future, here's what I want you to know about arbitration, is that if you sign a contract that says that I'm going to go to arbitration, you are basically saying I'm giving up my right to ever take this entity to court in a formal manner, and that I'm going to turn over any dispute I have with them to an arbitrator. And the only way you can, and then you go to the arbitrator, you tell them the problem, they tell you what's going to happen, and the only reason you can appeal that to a court is if the arbitrator did something wrong. You cannot appeal the decision or the wrongness of the arbitrator's decision. You can only appeal if the arbitrator did something outside the arbitrator's role. So we're giving a lot of our, so a lot of big corporations are hiding behind arbitration because what's happening in terms of conflict and issues coming up between customers and those corporations are never hitting the public courts because all their customers have signed private arbitration agreements and nothing can ever go to court. That's the difference between arbitration and mediation. In mediation, you come in, you meet with the other side. If you come to an agreement, great. If not, you go to court, right? That's the difference. I don't tell you what to do. I don't tell you how you should resolve it. So the difference really is decision-making authority for arbitrators versus mediators. Other questions? So I'm going to go back to the whole life path thing for a minute. As you are working with others and as you become a professional, and some of you are probably already professionals, I just think it's really important that we don't take our life history and act like it's the other person's life history, and that their life is anything at all like ours. Like, to me, that is the greatest problem in the way that we interact with others in today's culture, actually, is that if my friend tells me a problem, my immediate reaction is to go inside of me and take my 54 years of history and say, here's what you should do. Well, how relevant is that if their 54 years have looked totally different than mine? You know, I've grown up in Salt Lake. I'm, you know, all these things. What if this person I've known for a year and they grew up on the East Coast? How relevant is my experience to their experience for me to be giving them advice? I try not to give anyone advice unless they ask me for it, because I don't believe that I know what's best for anybody in terms of what they're doing. Any comments on that? Do y'all kind of get that? Come on, group, help me out here. Someone say something. Yeah, thank you.
This is Kylan Logan. Yeah, I think just to kind of, maybe I'm putting it in my own reality, what you just said.
Please
but
do.
In a lot of ways, it really is like that. People have a different reality than you do, and putting it through the prism, or, you know, the lens of how you view your life and do that, it really, it doesn't help the person. You're going to miss something. It's got to be from their point of view that they're working through their problems, not yours, before they're going to be able to lead anywhere positive, is what I've noticed.
And I'm going to assume that, I mean, if you're in an MBA program, there's going to be a time when you're going to have employees, and you're going to be a manager, and you're going to be mentoring or coaching these employees, right? There's going to be a difference between you telling them what to do and you working through it, and you walking them through it and letting them find their own way. And there's and actually what's coming to my mind right now is there's a guy named David Rock, and he is a neuroscience guy, and basically he wrote a book, and I can't think of the name of it right now. David Rock is his name, R-O-C-K, where he basically talks about the role of leaders and the role of managers is to ask questions of our staff. And when we have a troubled employee, our role is to ask questions of them and to allow them to find their own way out instead of us telling them their way out. Because telling them their way out is only going to work for so long if it's not really the way out. And so, you know, as you're moving into those places, it takes longer. Why don't we do it? Because it takes longer. It's a lot more work to sit with someone and have them think it through, rather than you just tell them what to do and move on in your job. Yeah.
I think it's Quiet Leadership. Is that the book?
Yeah, just Quiet Leadership.
I've read it. Yeah.
Do you like it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's really good about helping people putting people in a position where they can discover their own solutions instead of just walking in and saying, here's how you should do it.
Yeah, that's it. Yep, Quiet Leadership. Thank you. Yeah, I love that guy. And there's like a series of 7 questions or something that he goes through. Really quite interesting. Brad, what else do you want me to talk about?
Kathy, do you have an opinion about whether it's okay, if you're the mediator, to allow the two parties to get in a fight? I mean, what are the positives and negatives of allowing
like
that?
Physically?
Yeah, maybe punch each other, or
wow.
No, I'm just more verbal. I mean, at what point should a mediator turn that off, or should they let it? What is your thought on that?
Well, here's my response to that. What we resist persists. Okay? That's my response to that. What we resist persists. So a couple things. A lot of people are not comfortable with a lot of emotion. Okay? And we can do some gender stereotypes here, but I'm not going to. But there are a lot of people out there that are not comfortable with emotion. Well, here's what I want to say about that. The reason we have conflict in this world is because of emotional responses. If we don't care about something to a place where we have an emotional response about it, there is no conflict. So when people say take the emotion out of the conflict, it's ridiculous. There is no way to take the emotion out of a conflict because the emotion is what is causing the conflict. The emotional response, the caring, the drive, the whatever. So my answer to you is people need to be able to move through their emotions, and they need to be able to move through what they need to say to the other person. So I think about this one case. It was one of my favorite cases ever. It was a couple, and they were really high conflict. And there was one attorney. The woman had an attorney, and the guy didn't. And the four of us were sitting at the table, and the man and the woman were sitting across from each other, and the attorney was over here, and I was looking at him. And these two started going at it, like literally, like yelling at each other. As a mediator, I don't stop it unless it becomes really disrespectful, okay? If they're just saying their own stuff, I don't care if they yell. In fact, I had a case about 2 years ago in the summer, and I have a little farm home that I've renovated into my office, and it has a screen door. And I was sitting in there with a couple, and they were yelling so loud I was worried that the neighbors were going to call thinking it was a domestic dispute. Literally, I was like thinking, if you guys don't stop it soon, like the cops are going to show up, right? So I have this couple, and they are like just yelling at each other. And I look up, and this attorney is just like, oh my, attorneys are the worst. Like attorneys are doing this conflict work, and yet they hate they like don't know what to do in conflict, right? And so I look at this attorney, and he is just like white, like looking at me like, why aren't you doing something, right? And they're boo, ba boo, ba boo, just going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And finally, if you let them do it, what we resist persists. If I cut in and say stop it, guess what? In 5 minutes, they're going to be back up there. And then I'm going to stop it, and then in 5 minutes, they're going to be back up there. And so if you can play it out and allow it to play out, as long as it's not name-calling and disrespectful, at one point, it was like the woman didn't have anything else to say, and she just felt like she had to do something. So she looks across the table at her soon-to-be ex and just went, like that was her, like she had nothing else, okay? And all of a sudden, they just burst out laughing. It was so ridiculous. And from then on, solved it like within a half an hour, right? Because they just had to get it out. And she just like had nothing else. And so it was just like, this is all I've got. I have nothing else to say. Everyone burst out laughing, resolved the case. So yeah, I think as long as it's respectful, that people need to be able to get that emotion out. Because if we push the emotion down, when they leave, they're going to go back to their office fuming. And again, you as managers, you need to know that there's probably nothing that costs organizations today more money than unresolved conflict. And I used to have like the stats in my head, but what comes back to my mind is that if you take 20 full-time employees, that every time you give them a paycheck, one of those paychecks, the whole time of that paycheck has been wasted on unresolved conflict in your organization, okay? So out of 20 employees full-time, 40 hours of a full-time week for every 20 employees was wasted on unresolved conflict. Because what you need to understand as a manager is that it's not just the conflict that's bubbling up and that you can see. The most damaging conflict is the conflict that is not bubbling up, that you can't see. And it's the conflict where, and here's the one thing I want to say about what you're going to do at 11 o'clock. And Brad, I don't mean to go against you, but I would never recommend that a manager mediate, they're another manager that they're over and the employee. Because one of the roles of a mediator is to be totally unbiased and neutral. You can't tell me that that manager does not have something, and the minute you put the lower manager in where the upper manager is the mediator, this lower manager is in a bind. I would not want to be the lower manager being mediated by my boss. I don't know where I was going with that, but
So go ahead and take that as you do this next case. Go ahead and consider that.
yeah, I mean, what I would say is, and consider changing it up to say that you're an outside person coming in to try to resolve it, and think about how you would do it differently if you weren't someone else's boss in the mediation.
So my question as a mediator, because one thing I notice in conflict, one side will present a case and the other side hears what they want to hear to build their argument against it. How do you increase listening as a mediator and true communication to say, no, this person really said this? How do you facilitate that?
Do you want me to tell you all my secrets? Is that like the deal here? Okay, and I will tell you, it's like so amazingly simple. Sometimes when we're in conflict with someone, especially if it's a long-term conflict like a marriage or a workplace situation, we are so anti that other person that the minute the other person even opens their mouth and we hear their voice, guess what? We totally tune out, right? Think about it. So as a mediator, one of the tools I use is I parrot what is being said. So literally, if someone says something and I look over at the other person and I'm thinking, wow, that was impactful, and the other person is sitting there stone-faced, what I'm saying to myself is, they didn't even hear what that person just said. And the other thing, before I go on with that, the other thing is that in neuroscience, we now know that's true. If you look at the new outcomes in neuroscience, our filters in our brain only allow through what we expect. So the minute someone we are in conflict with starts talking and we hear their voice, our expectation is to not like what they're saying and not agree with what they're saying. I've literally had couples where one of the parents will give the other one a compliment, like, I think you're a really good dad, or I think you're a really good mom, or you do this really well. And I look over at the other person and they're stone-faced. And then I look at them and I say, do you hear what they just said? Yeah. And I say, what did they just say? And they give me this long thing, not one thing about you're a good dad or you're a good mom. And I'll say, but did you hear when they said that he thinks you're a good mom? No. Sometimes it's me saying what they said in my voice because they'll listen to my voice, literally, and they won't listen to the other person's voice. So repeating, asking questions, parroting what is said, I tease people all the time, I sit around all day listening, asking questions, and repeating what people say for the big bucks. Really, that's what I do as a mediator, because that is what is needed for people who are in conflict, is someone to sit with them, listen, have a calm demeanor, and to be able to say what it is the other person is saying in a different way, maybe in a different tone of voice, and to ask questions about what's being said so that they can fully hear and understand each other. Literally, that's what a mediator does.
Kathy, I just want to make a comment. One of the things I love about having you is I learned so much. My life path has been, for the most part, an executive in fairly large organizations. Yours has been more of a mediator. My sense is that there are times when it was good for me as a manager to tell and say, this is the way it's going to be.
Absolutely.
But for the most part, I would say 90% of the times that I've told, those have come back to bite me because no one else bought into that. And had I have more often allowed people to come up with their own resolution and their own plan, they would have felt like it was theirs and they would have been more committed to it. So I really love, as you come to listen to the advice that you give. And one other experience that I'll share, I probably shouldn't. I remember being in a room with a colleague and my boss, both of our bosses, and I had so much conflict with this other person, and he with me, and it got to the point where we did start yelling at each other. And the boss was rather new to the organization, so I'm sure.
What have I done?
I'm sure he loved that. But after that experience, I have had a much better relationship with this person. And had he have cut that off, I have a feeling that we would have never gotten to some of the key issues that we had with one another. So I just wanted to share a couple of experiences.
Yeah, and I had something I wanted to say about the first point that you made. The other thing for me is that the minute I tell someone what to do, be it one of my employees or whatever, guess what? They now have someone to blame if it doesn't work. I mean, that's how I look at it now. Like, if I tell someone how to solve the problem and it doesn't work, guess what? When they have another bad review in a month, they can say, well, you told me to try this and I did, and now you're telling me I'm still in trouble because it didn't work. So I'm like, you figure it out. I'm not going to take responsibility for telling you how to fix your problem, because if what I tell you doesn't work, I'm on the hook, and now you're not taking responsibility again. And I have a couple really big things in my life, and one is that I want people to take responsibility. And so the minute I start telling them, I am releasing them. You know, my mentor, Diane Hamilton, who was the director who did that thing with that family that I watched and was amazed with, you know, one of the things she taught me is that when people are in pain, and I believe that when people are in conflict, they're in pain, okay? When people are in pain, they're just looking for a way out of the pain. And if you give them a way out, they will take it because it's the easy way out. So if I'm sitting with a couple who are struggling about how to communicate about their kids, and I tell them how to do it, they are going to agree that that will work because they just want to get out, right? They want the pain to go away. They want a solution. They want a way out. But guess what? It's not going to work for them. So I've got to be able to sit with them and allow them to feel that angst long enough to where they figure out what's going to work for them. And you know what? If they can't, then let them go to the court and let the court tell them how it's going to happen. I'm not going to tell them how it's going to happen because it's them. Let them sit in the angst. If you have an employee who's struggling, talk with them. Let them come up with the solution. If they can't come up with it, tell them to think about it over the weekend. Don't tell them how to do it. Let them sit in the angst of their own problem and take responsibility. You telling them to take responsibility and what to do is not them taking responsibility. It is giving them another person to blame when it doesn't work. To me, it's just so clear that I don't want to be responsible for other people. The last thing I want to share, because I know time is running out, is that don't ever forget that there's only one person we can change in this world. And guess what? It's not the other person. And we spend so much time trying to change the other person. We spend so much time trying to do something that will trigger them, that will do something to make them see our point, or we spend so much time and energy trying to change them. Take that time and energy and figure out what you can do differently so that you can cope with them in a way that works better for you. To me, it's all about me being able to deal with it in me, not trying. We cannot deal with we cannot change our external environment. We can only deal with how we react to our external environment. And just think about that, because that's all we have control over. And as long as we continue to try to change the external environment, we're going to continue to be disappointed and frustrated. But if we can change what's in here to be more accepting, we probably will have a better life. That makes sense? Is that too much?
Kathy, one last comment or question. So when you think about mediation and conflict, what are kind of 3 fundamentals that you want us to remember? What are kind of 3 key things that if you really wanted to help us be better in those situations, what would they be?
Well, the first one is that, and one of the things I was going to do is I was going to have you, so let's just do it for 2 seconds. I'm going to say a word. You tell me the first word that comes to your mind, okay? So the word is conflict. Yell out words that come to your mind. Anger, resolution, uncomfortable, Russia. Okay? Okay. Typically what happens when I say what comes to your mind when we hear the word conflict, it's typically negative words, right? Resolution, you guys are outside the norms, okay? Typically what I hear is normal or are negative words. Number 1 is we have to change our relationship to conflict. Conflict is what makes change happen. There is no change. Think about what our lives would look like without conflict. I always say we would be like these amoebas just crawling around on the earth if we didn't have conflict pushing us into changes. So change your relationship with conflict and see it as an opportunity and as something good in your life to learn something, if nothing else, about yourself and how you feel about the issue or the person. I mean, second, I've already kind of said it. It's all about what's in you, not about changing the other person. You are never going to change the other person, so quit trying. And the third one, I don't know.
This is Lauren and Logan. I don't know if I'm just bitter, but I feel like if you don't have optimism to change other people's bad behavior, then you're letting them off the hook and letting them get away with bad behavior instead of incentivizing them to be better.
Well, I don't know that just by trying to deal with me that I'm going to let someone off the hook. If I'm a manager and I have someone who's a problem, I'm going to be bringing them in and talking to them and having them come up with a plan. And at some point, I will say that at some point as a manager, after you've tried to let them figure it out on their own, I'm going to tell them what to do, right? I think our approach always should be let them figure it out on their own. But let's be honest, there are those who we're just going to have to finally say, this is the deal, or I'm going to let you go. I'm not saying be a doormat, but I'm saying that don't let them get to you in a way where you feel responsible for them. I mean, you get to set your boundaries and you get to hold them responsible, but you are never, there's nothing you could, I have a niece that's really like a problem child in our family, and my mother always wants to save her and rescue her. And I always just say to my mom, there's nothing you can do or say that is going to change her, that is going to get her to stop doing what she's doing until she wants to. So I take the same kind of thing as that we're not going to change anyone until they really want to do it. We can set our boundaries and we can set our expectations, and then they get to do what they're going to do with it. But it's not us changing them, it's them deciding to finally change.